Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to today's Lunch Hour Lecture. I'm Jack Ashby from the UCL Grant Museum of Zoology, here to welcome you and the speaker today to today's talk. Before we start, just to let anyone who's watching remotely, if they would like to send in any questions for the end of the talk, you can use the Slido code 9041 on www.sly.do. So please do that. Likewise, anyone in the room can also do that if they don't want to raise their hand at the end of the talk. So to welcome today's speaker, Professor Tim Blackburn. Tim is the Professor of Invasion Biology here at UCL's Genetics, Evolution and the Environment Department. He's a true leader in the research of invasion biology, with a particular focus on the effect of invasive species on island birds and looking into how the species we transport around the world have an effect on the animals that live there. You may have seen a lot of his work in the press recently, particularly on the topic he's going to be talking to us today about, which is following birds on the pathway to invasion. If you join me in welcoming Professor Tim Blackburn.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thanks everyone for coming. So in 1999, just before the turn of the millennium, I was lucky enough to be awarded some grant money to travel to visit a colleague of mine in New Zealand. And this was a source of huge excitement for me. I've been a bird person all my life, and when you go to somewhere on the other side of the world that you haven't been before, like New Zealand, there's always a great opportunity to see some of the sort of unusual and endemic species that live in that part of the world. And I'll never forget my first day in New Zealand. We landed in Christchurch, and I was sort of immediately out into the countryside to see what I could see, and I was completely knocked out by the birds that were on show in the countryside there. Unfortunately, I was knocked out not in a good way, because it turned out that most of the birds around the sort of Canterbury plains of South Island in New Zealand are not native New Zealand birds at all. They're species like this, which, if you're into birds at all, you'll probably recognize are common birds from the UK. So these are species like the song thrush, the starling, house sparrow, blackbird, species that should not be within sort of several thousand miles of New Zealand, but were super abundant in the New Zealand countryside. And it never really sort of occurred to me sort of how interesting this phenomenon of species that are not meant to be in an area is. And this was probably a bit unusual because I'd grown up in the UK. I'd been, for more than 30 years, I've been watching birds in the UK. And if you're a bird watcher in the UK, we actually have quite a few species here, probably sort of 20 to 25 species of bird resident in the UK that are not supposed to be here. So they're species that people have brought here from other parts of the world and have established populations. So if you live in London, I guess most of you do, you're probably very familiar with the ring-necked parakeets, probably familiar with the Canada goose, things like this Egyptian goose. But there's a whole variety of species that have been brought to the UK from around the world by people. They're not supposed to be here. And this got me thinking about the science of what we call alien species. So just so everyone's on the same page, I'm going to be talking about alien species today. An alien species are species that are not meant to be or not naturally present in the flora or fauna of an area, but they're species that are there because people have moved them beyond their normal distribution to an area where they don't naturally occur. And these species may subsequently spread widely across the environment, and if they do that, we call them invaders, so alien invaders. So I will try and use the term alien. I inevitably will slip during the talk and say things like exotic or non-native or introduced, but these are all synonyms of these species that are in areas where they don't naturally occur. I'm interested in birds, but there's a whole variety of species in pretty much every taxon that we can consider to be aliens. So here are just a sort of a sample of the species you might know from the UK. Again, the parakeets, but you'll also be familiar with the grey squirrels, the brown rats, things like this marsh frog, which I photographed in London a few months ago, or the sort of oak tree processionary moth, which is spreading through London and potentially is going to be a problem in the future. So we have hundreds and thousands of alien species around the world, but there are millions of species, and most of them are not yet alien species. So a sort of a key question in studying alien species is, what is it that determines why some species are aliens and potentially invaders, where others are not? And this has been a topic I've been researching for the last sort of 15 years or so. Now, people have been studying alien species sort of seriously for probably about 50 years now. And over the first 30 years of study into aliens, there wasn't really very much progress made in terms of understanding why invasions occurred, to the point where even the scientists that studied the process were suggesting that maybe this was just completely idiosyncratic and unknowable. But over the last 20 years or so, we've started to make much more progress in understanding invasions. And a big part of this was the realization that an alien invasion is not actually a unitary process. It's actually a series of processes that a species has to go through, from being a native species in its sort of own distribution, minding its own business, as it were, to being an alien invader in an area in which it doesn't naturally occur. And we can divide the sort of processes typically into sort of 4 stages, which we can term transport, introduction, establishment, and spread. And to become an alien invasive, a species has to pass through each of these stages, and it can potentially fail at any one of them. So to take the example of New Zealand here, there are around 30 or so alien bird species established in New Zealand. Obviously, most birds in the world are not established as aliens in New Zealand. And so the first reason why is that most bird species simply haven't been transported to the island of New Zealand. So a species won't become an alien invader if it's not transported to a new area. If a species is transported to a new area, it's not going to become an alien invader if it doesn't get out into the environment in that area. So, for example, here in London, just across Regent's Park, we've got lots of species that are not native to the UK, but they're not going to have a chance to establish an alien population here because, hopefully, they're not going to get out of their cages and start to spread, although occasionally some of them do. So some species do get transported to an area, they do get out into the environment, or they get released, or they escape, but then they're not going to become an alien invader if those individuals that get out into the environment don't establish a viable population in that area. So, species could get out into the environment in New Zealand, and many species have been released there, but not subsequently established a viable population because all of the individuals have died out. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that anyone's tried to introduce wood pigeons into New Zealand, because they haven't. It's just I happened to get this picture of this wood pigeon, which for some reason had just fallen off its perch and died in the tree outside the flat that I live in London. And it's kind of really unusual to see a bird that's just like dead like that, sitting in a tree. That was last March. This was this weekend. It's still in the tree. It's just not quite in such a good state. So nobody can get to it. It's just slowly rotting away. So a species can become an alien if it gets transported to an area, gets released or escaped into the wild there. It establishes a viable population. So an example of an alien species is this kookaburra, has a small alien population on the North Island of New Zealand. So we can call this an alien, but it's not an alien invader, because although it's established, the population hasn't really spread beyond the location of introduction. So it may do in the future, but so far it hasn't. On the other hand, we have species like this dunnock, which I'm sure will be familiar to most of you here, a common British bird. So this has been transported from New Zealand, from the UK to New Zealand. It's been introduced in a few locations around New Zealand, and it's established and spread widely. So this is a species that we consider to be an alien invader in New Zealand. It occurs in pretty much every habitat across this country, many thousands of miles from where the species is supposed to occur. So to become an alien invader, a species has to pass through all these different stages of the invasion process, and it can fail to become an invader because it fails at each of these stages. But to understand the invasion process, what we actually need to do is to study success or failure at each of these stages. So you need to look at, what succeeds in being introduced amongst the species that are introduced, which succeed in establishing, and so on and so forth. And this has been what I've been sort of doing for about the last 15 years or so. So over the last 5 or 6 years, to sort of try and make a bit more progress into these sorts of questions, I have worked with this lady here, Ellie Dyer. Originally she was my technician, then my PhD student. She's now my postdoc. And we've worked to put together a global database on the distribution of alien bird species around the world. So trying to pull together all the records we've got of where species have been introduced, where they've established populations, and so on and so forth. And it took Ellie about 3 years to put this database together. She's collated more than 27,000 distribution records from a wide variety of published sources and talking to a wide variety of experts around the world to pull together what we've termed the Global Avian Invasions Atlas, or GAVIA. GAVIA, as it happens, is the genus name of divers, like this great northern diver here. So it's an acronym that is a bird name, but no divers have ever been introduced anywhere in the world as far as we're aware. But putting together this database and then analysing it over the last few years has allowed us to make some real progress in understanding sort of the drivers of the invasion process for birds. So I'm going to start, having said that you need to study each of these stages separately, I'm going to start by just lumping these first two, because often you don't know sort of what's been transported but not introduced, because the first time you sort of have evidence of a species potentially being an alien species is when you see individuals sort of released into the wild, some of which may succeed or some of which may fail. And so in GAVIA, we've actually got more records than this, but we've got sort of somewhere over 3,500 records of bird introductions around the world that have a date attached to them. So these are records of a certain species being released to a certain country or region outside their native range with a date on it. And this allows us to plot the number of introductions at different dates over time. So we've sort of cut things off at 1500 AD, so there were introductions before this. People have been moving birds around for more than 8,000 years, and they've been moving species around for more than 20,000 years that we know about. But we cut it off at 1500 because of sort of issues of data reliability. And we also cut it off at 2000 because beyond that, species records may not be getting into the literature. So this is just a sort of a convenient time period to look at. And what you can clearly see from this graph is that initially there are relatively few bird introductions. So these are 25-year time periods, so there's relatively few introductions in each of these time periods. But then around the middle of the 19th century, we see a real sort of uptick in the numbers of species that are being moved to areas around the world. So each of these sort of dashed lines here divides this data into quartiles. So sort of the first quarter of these 3,500 introductions occurred between 1500 and 1903, but sort of 3/4 of the introductions in that period occurred after 1850. So in that period we have got over 900 separate introduction events of 245 different species to 167 different countries. And if we think about why there was an uptick at around about that point, it's actually to do with colonial expansion of European powers around that time, and especially the British. Now the British sort of colonized lots of parts of the world, and in many parts of the world where they colonized, they set up organizations with a specific aim of naturalizing, introducing beneficial species for the sort of the good of the people in that environment. And these acclimatisation societies were were sort of set up all around the world. They were particularly strong in New Zealand. There were several in New Zealand. And for about 100 years, they worked actively to introduce alien species to these environments. New Zealand's a really interesting case in point because there's really good records of what they did there. So here's a letter from the Canterbury Acclimatisation Society. It's not really very readable, but the core details of this letter were published in the Press newspaper in New Zealand in 1876. So here's just a little snippet from that. So Mr. Bills was a very well-known bird collector from the Brighton region in Britain. And he, on this boat, set out with a consignment of birds to take to New Zealand. So just over 1,000 individual birds that he collected in the area around Brighton, including 74 partridges, 117 blackbirds, 74 thrushes, 33 starlings, 180 yellowhammers, redpolls, goldfinches, linnets, hedge sparrows. We saw the dunnock earlier. And it turns out that he got all of the goldfinches, yellowhammers and redpolls all the way across from the UK to New Zealand on a boat, so a journey of several weeks. Unfortunately, however, he lost the 500 leeches that he'd shipped in that consignment as well. But anyway, this is just one of many consignments of birds that were ordered by people in New Zealand and were shipped out there with the specific aim of introducing these species to New Zealand. And if we look at the sort of global picture, so this is all introductions in that period from 1500 to 1903. This top map shows areas where birds were introduced to in that period. So the sort of hotter the colour, the more species of bird were introduced to those regions. And you can see that the map of where bird species are introduced in this period very well picks out the British Empire, essentially. So these British colonials were shipping things out to their sort of colonies, and also they were sending things back from the colonies to the UK. This map down here shows the distribution of the native ranges of species that are being moved around. So you can see that most of the species that are being moved around here are species from Europe that the colonists are sending out, so the British are sending out to their colonies. So this is highlighting in that historic data the impact of acclimatisation societies moving species around. Now, I said that these dotted lines divided these sort of dated introductions into quarters. So the first quarter spanned the period from 1500 to 1903. The last quarter here has spanned the period from 1983 to 2000. So we have as many examples of introductions of birds to locations in the 17 years from 83 to 2000 as we had in the 403 years from 1500 to 1903. So you can see that while there was a big uptick in the rate at which bird species were being introduced in the middle of the 19th century, there's been an even greater increase over the last 50 years or so. Not only are we getting a much greater rate of introductions, but those species, we're getting a wider range of species being moved, and they're being moved to more countries. So we're seeing a real expansion of this process of alien species introductions. So about the same number of introductions in this period as in this period, but more species to more locations. And what's driving this expansion really is the trade in cage birds or pet birds. So we've sort of realized now that introducing species deliberately to areas where they don't naturally occur is not always a good idea. And so we don't have acclimatisation societies anymore. They sort of died out around about 50 years ago. But now we have an enormous trade in cage birds. So particularly in rapidly developing and developed economies in the Near East and the Far East, there's a strong culture of keeping birds in cages. And often having a cage bird is a sign of wealth. It's a sign that you've got disposable income. You can spend it on a pet bird, you can keep that bird, and it's indicative of status. And so what you can see really there's been a marked change in where bird species are being introduced and where the species that are being introduced have come from. So you'll remember in the colonial period that most of the bird species were coming from Europe, and they were going to the British countries that were part of the British Empire. In the last 20 years, or in the 83 to 2000 period, what we're seeing is many more species that are being introduced, particularly in the Near East here. It's not quite so clear, but there are real hotspots in the Far East. Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, for example, are all hotspots. Although we are continuing to see sort of introductions in some of those areas that were historically important for introductions sort of 150, 200 years ago. If we look at where species are coming from, really not Europe now, but the cage bird trade in the Far East is driving lots of species being moved from sort of east, sort of South and Southeast Asia, and there's a real growth in species being moved from Africa, which is largely driven by movements of species into the Near East. So there's been a real switch in the kinds of species that are being moved, where they're being moved to, and where they're being taken from. We can do some very simple analysis just to hammer home that point. So if we look in the historical era 1500 to 1903, what we see is there's a significant effect of whether a country was part of the British Empire in terms of the number of bird species it received. So countries that were part of the British Empire got more species than countries that weren't part of the British Empire, but there's no significant effect of disposable income on the number of species that are getting moved. If we look in the modern era, there's now no effect of whether a country is part of the British Empire or not, but we see a significant effect of the amount of disposable income that people have on whether bird species are going to be introduced. So trade, the cage bird trade, is really driving these modern introductions. And just to give you one example, I have a student, Su Shan, who was working in Taiwan, where there's a very active cage bird trade there. The bird culture in Taiwan is really interesting. There's a whole variety of reasons why people keep birds or buy birds there. So partly they buy birds as pets. Partly they buy birds for singing competitions. So they'll go out bird walking and they'll have singing competitions with some species. The white-eye is one of the species they use for singing competitions. And then also as part of the sort of Eastern religious culture, they have a practice of prayer animal release. So to accrue karma under Eastern religions, one way to do that is to do a good deed, and one good deed that you can do is to release an animal from captivity into the wild. So here we see a prayer bird shop. There's a woman in there. You go in, you get a box of birds, so you get 25 birds in a box. You go down to the temple, you release the birds, you fly away. They fly away, you accrue karma. Then some guy goes around, catches all the birds again, takes them back to the shop, and so the cycle continues. But anyway, in a very short survey, about sort of a two or 3 month survey, a couple of years ago, Su Shan went around the bird shops in Taiwan. She sampled about a third of the bird shops in the country, or that she could find details of in the country. And she was able to record more than 26,000 individual birds for sale for more than 240 species. And Taiwan is an area where there's lots of established alien species in the wild, and we know at least 90 alien bird species have been recorded from the wild in Taiwan. Obviously, practices like buying birds and releasing them is not going to help that situation. So that sort of explains why we're seeing birds introduced where they are. So the next stage then is establishment. So given that birds are getting out into the wild, what determines whether the population establishes and forms a viable alien population or just dies out? And there's a whole variety of things that could be going on here. So we might expect characteristics of the environment to matter. We might expect characteristics of the species being introduced to matter. So we might expect some species to be better at establishing an alien population than others. But it turns out that by far the biggest driver of establishment success in alien birds is the number of bird individuals that are getting released in that population. So here we actually have data from New Zealand. Those acclimatisation societies who did us a real service by recording lots of details of those species that they were introducing, including the numbers of individuals that they were releasing. So here we have simply these blue-grey bars here show how many species are released in different numbers, different population sizes. So this tall grey bar here is showing us that most of the bird species that were introduced in New Zealand were introduced in small numbers. So 20 individuals or fewer were being released into the environment. And relatively few were being released in larger numbers, so 100 individuals or more. These dark grey bars, on the other hand, show the distribution of those species that succeeded. So while most species are being released in small numbers, most of the species that are succeeding are the ones that are being released in large numbers. So what that simply shows us is that if you're releasing 20 individual birds or fewer into New Zealand, that release is probably going to fail. If you're releasing 100 individuals or more into New Zealand, that release is probably going to succeed. And we all know that we sort of tend to be very worried as biologists about small populations of species. So when a population gets down to a small number, we worry that just by chance it's going to go extinct. And exactly those same processes that we worry about in terms of conservation also apply to species introduction. So the more individuals you have, the more likely it is that a population is going to persist. So that's the primary determinant of whether a species that gets out into the wild then establishes a population. So then on top of that, at sort of the end of the process, then those populations can spread to a greater or lesser degree. And the sum total of all those patterns of introduction, establishment, and spread gives us the picture of where alien bird species are most likely to be found. And so as part of the Gavia database, we were able to get maps of the distributions of most of the bird species with alien populations around the world, and we're able to therefore produce this, which is a global map of alien bird species richness. So the hotter colours again are areas with more alien bird species. The bluer colours are areas with fewer alien bird species, and the grey land masses are areas that, as far as we know, don't yet have any alien bird species established. So you can see that there are sort of some clear hotspots of alien bird species around the world. We've talked a bit about New Zealand, Taiwan here. You can just about see Hong Kong and Singapore as little red dots. Growing numbers around the Near East, the UK, through the Caribbean, and particularly California and Florida are really nice areas for alien bird species, and the Hawaiian Islands as well. If you've ever been to Hawaii, like New Zealand, basically all you see is alien bird species. But then we can take this map and we can start overlaying lots of other different variables to try and understand why it is. You know, what's the key processes determining which species have more alien bird species than others? Sorry, which regions? So we can do these statistical models. And when we do that, we find that there are four factors that come out as important in determining which areas have more alien bird species. So the first thing is how many species were introduced. So if you've had lots of bird species introduced to an area, it's just more likely that more of those species will have established alien populations. It makes good sense. Really, you can't have many more alien bird species in an area than have been introduced. It turns out that the longer the time since the first introduction to an area, the more alien bird species there are. So this is simply telling us that where alien bird species have had more time to establish populations and spread, then we find more of them. The closer you are to a historic port, the more likely an area is to have alien bird species, and this again reflects human history. So all of these variables relate to where people are taking bird species and the amount of time those species have had to spread out. But finally, there is one sort of natural determinant of alien bird species richness, and this is native bird species richness. So many people have hypothesized that where you have lots of native birds, they may resist the arrival of alien species, but it turns out that the reverse is true. So in areas, accounting for all these other factors, in areas where you've got lots of native bird species, you also have lots of alien bird species. So areas that are good for natives are also good for aliens. This has been colloquially described as the rich get richer. It's true for alien birds as it is in many other parts of society as well. Now, please don't tweet this if you are tweeting. This is a paper that's due out in the next week or so, so it's currently under embargo. So far, I've just been talking about alien birds, but these processes in terms of introducing more species are ongoing, and they apply to all taxa across sort of the spectrum of life. So I've been working with colleagues across Europe and the world, and we've compiled a data set of more than 40,000 first records of species. So obviously around about 4,000 of those are our bird data, but most are other taxa. So we've got more than 16,000 established alien species. And what you can see is that the pattern that we saw for birds is replicated across all taxa. So for most of the last 500 years, there have been not many introductions, but then in the middle of the 19th century, an increase, which has just carried on through the 20th century. And we've gone from a situation where over most of the history of introductions, we're getting around 7 alien species first records per year, to a situation in 1996 where we were having around about 1.5 a day. So alien species are an ongoing problem, all taxa, all over the world. So to conclude, well, what I just said, alien species, they're everywhere. There's hardly any part of the world that doesn't have them. They're from all different sorts of taxa. To understand this process, we need to break it down into the different components. And when we can do that, and as we start to get better data on where sort of aliens are and the processes that got them there, so we can start to sort of understand the drivers of the whole process. What we see is that human actions are important at all stages, but we also are starting to, by controlling for that, identify some environmental drivers too. And all of this matters because alien species have impacts. So alien species have contributed to the extinction of more vertebrate species than any other cause since 1500. So over this historical period that we've been talking about here, alien species have driven more vertebrate extinctions even than habitat destruction. And I just wanted to finish with one example to illustrate this. So coming back to New Zealand again, going to New Zealand, I was knocked out by the numbers, superabundance of European bird species there, but actually through most of New Zealand it's very difficult to see any native bird species, and the reason is that most of those species have gone extinct. So a lot of those extinctions have been because the first human colonists, the Maori, drove a lot of species to extinction through hunting, but actually most of the species that have gone from New Zealand have gone because of the impact of other alien species that have got there with people. So initially with the Pacific rat with the Maori, but then subsequently with cats, black and brown rats, stoats, ferrets, and so on, after the arrival of the first Europeans. And here's just one particularly sad example. There were a variety of species that had been eliminated from most of New Zealand by these alien predators. So there were small populations that were relocated to Big South Cape Island here, which was predator-free. So these populations were able to persist because there were no predators on this island. In the 1960s, I think it was 1963, there was a ship accidentally released some rats onto, I think it was a ship that accidentally released rats onto Big South Cape Island. And within a few weeks, these rats had eliminated 3 vertebrate species. So the last individuals of the bush wren, this particular species of bat, and the New Zealand snipe were all found on Big South Cape Island, and they all went extinct in the few weeks following the invasion of this island by the black rat, I think it was. Anyway, I just want to finish up by acknowledging all my collaborators on all this work, a whole variety of colleagues across the world, and the people that have funded me. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions if we've got a few minutes for that.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Tim. Does anyone have a question in the audience? No? You've got one?
Hello.
Hi.
So this is a question from Slido, which I think you might have answered already, but essentially, hang on, I'm just reading because I've just seen another one. Okay, I'm going to read this one instead. How do you recognize the bird's original habitat? Could it not happen that the bird was introduced to the new habitat before 1500 and then reintroduced?
It is possible. There are, in fact, one or two species for which there is some debate about whether their distribution is natural or introduced. But by and large, for most species, we have sort of pretty good knowledge of sort of where things are native to. So we can very easily tell that they're not native. So all those species in New Zealand, for example, we know all of those sort of occur nowhere near there. There's one particularly interesting example of a species of jay in Mexico, where it has been debated as to whether that species is actually native to Mexico or whether it's a population that had been introduced from South America, because the Aztecs in Mexico were quite keen on importing birds, so they used feathers for their headdresses and so on, and there are historical records of the Aztecs having moved certain species to areas where they didn't occur. So there's this one jay where there's been some debate about whether it's a native or an alien. I think the genetics has now shown that it's definitely a native species and it's not the same as the one in South America. But by and large, we've got such good information for birds that we know these things.
There's a question here. Just wait for a microphone so people online can hear you. Thank you.
Would you consider that humans are an alien species too, since we've spread out into all these different environments?
Yes, I think you could argue that over most of the world, humans fit into the definition of an alien species. So obviously species move around naturally, so all an alien species is really is a species that hasn't moved in a natural way, it's been moved by people. So people have been moved by people, so arguably we're aliens. But I think you could possibly also make the example that humans are a special case in a number of ways, and we'll just consider everything that isn't a human when we think about alien species.
It's two in the middle.
Thank you. Apart from the caged bird phenomenon in the Far East, is animal transportation still increasing?
So transportation for the caged bird trade is really important, and as economies continue to grow and people get more disposable income, it's likely that will continue. There are parts of the world where the phenomenon is not increasing to a certain extent. So the EU is a case in point. Worries over bird flu about a decade ago meant that the EU introduced regulations to stop people importing birds from outside the EU. So that trade has largely been eliminated, barring a bit of illegal trade. Within the EU, there's still a big trade. So if you can go to bird shops in sort of different EU countries, and you can find species that have been bred in captivity or have been imported from other countries within the EU. But at least that's one area where we're not perpetuating this sort of global influx of birds. But essentially, yes, that's a global phenomenon that's I can see is going to continue to grow. There's no sign that the bird trade is dropping off anyway.
We might have time for just one quick question. If you want to pass the microphone back along, you keep the question and the answer brief, though, please.
So in the modern era, it sounds like birds were being transported largely for commercial reasons. I'm wondering, what was the rationale for transporting large numbers of birds during colonial periods? You were saying these societies which were actively actually moving birds from one country of origin to another place.
So there were two broad reasons. So very quickly, there was sort of perceived benefit. So a lot of them are game bird species, so that the people in New Zealand could enjoy the hunting that in the UK was only available to the sort of the rich and landed gentry. There were species introduced for biocontrol. So when they introduced agriculture to New Zealand, there were big sort of pest outbreaks, and they introduced species to try and control those pest outbreaks. And the third reason was pure and simple nostalgia. So they missed the bird songs from home, and so things like the blackbird and song thrush and goldfinch were introduced because they had attractive songs, and it was a reminder of home.
Brilliant. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. Thank you for your questions, but mostly thank you to Professor Tim Blackburn.